Hey everybody, Dave here at Ground Zero, talking all things comics and comics history in a segment we continue to call Interestingly Enough. As a lot of you are aware, Diamond has suspended comic shipments of new product for possibly the duration of the COVID-19 outbreak. On the very last week we received new comics, this was one of the titles, Road to Empire. Empire is this next company-wide crossover from Marvel. It seems like Marvel has one of these every couple of months, probably because Marvel has one of these every couple of months. And I even thought to myself, wouldn't it be great if somebody would ask, hey Dave, where did all these crossovers originate and why are they so important and prevalent today? Well, luckily for me, Carl Fulmer asked that very question. So we're going to tackle it not by talking about crossovers throughout time. We're going to go to a 2-year period in the 1980s where the whole universe of this was birthed. Now, in the 1980s, that was when the direct market really came into its own. But it was established a little before that in the 1970s. Phil Sealing and Seagate Distributors was actually the first, but it was in the 1980s that the direct market really became a force. And a couple of things happened. One is DC and Marvel both discovered the direct market, realized its potential, and started producing books just for the direct market. Second is there was a lot of independent, smaller press publishers that also started doing work for comic shops exclusively. Now, in many cases, they allowed creators to own their own creations and to own their own work. So this led to a really boom in creativity in comics. And a lot of stuff we know today all comes directly from that period. Now, as the 1980s opened, DC and Marvel could not have been more different companies. Marvel was, quite frankly, just killing DC in sales. DC was an embarrassed and, frankly, kind of befuddled also-ran when it came to the sales charts. And the companies were just so different, and that's the reason for it. Marvel's universe was just so much more comprehensible and readable. But you got to understand, at the dawn of the 80s, Marvel was barely 20 years old, and its entire universe had created by a relative handful of creators, all under the direction and guidance of either Stan Lee or Roy Thomas. DC, on the other hand, was the result of hundreds and hundreds of creators, all working independently, writing stories they had no idea was someday going to be expected to fit into a single patchwork of continuity. The result was an incomprehensible mess. In the early 1960s, when Gardner Fox wrote Flash of Two Worlds, it was a great story. It was an interesting concept, and the fans loved it. But it opened the floodgate for all sorts of alternate universes, alternate timelines, and the result made most fans' heads simply explode. Now that brings us to 1981. In 1981, this issue of Green Lantern had a letter from a fan who asked why a character in an earlier issue did not recognize Green Lantern when they had actually met just a couple of years earlier in an issue of Showcase. Frankly, this kind of embarrassed Marv Wolfman, but more than that, it frustrated him. Marv Wolfman had come to DC from Marvel Comics, and he was having trouble fitting his stories in because he didn't understand the continuity himself. So he went to first his friend Len Wein, and then president of DC Comics at the time, Jeanette Kahn, and managing editor Dick Giordano, and suggested a series he had an idea for. This series that was designed to clean up DC's continuity and leave it with one single, consistent, understandable timeline. He suggested that series be called The History of the DC Universe. Everybody involved signed off on this series, and he got right to work. Now, they made announcements and expected this series would hit in 1982. They announced it at a convention in 1981. In the December 1981 issue of Comics Journal, they had a blurb about it. So 1982, here it comes. But one of the first things they did was hire somebody who had either the luckiest or unluckiest job in all of comics, because his job was to sit in DC's massive library of comics and read every single comic DC had published. It took him 2 years. It took him 2 years to read all those comics, and he compiled notes of births, deaths, powers, everything you can think of in this massive, massive ream of notes and turned them over to Marv Wolfman. So this series was not going to happen in 1982. They pushed it back first to 1983. Then they knew they still weren't going to get there, so they pushed it back to 1985, because 1985 they knew was going to be the 50th anniversary of DC Comics. And what better way to celebrate the 50th anniversary of DC Comics than to clean up the continuity of DC Comics? Giving them all this extra time allowed them to bring in George Perez, who was arguably the best comic book artist of the 1980s. An amazing artist, beloved by comic fans. He was excited to be part of this project for two reasons. One, this was going to change DC's image, and he wanted to be a part of that. Second, he wanted revenge on Marvel because he had so poured his heart and soul into the Justice League Avengers crossover, which he felt was scuttled by difficulty from Marvel. So he's on board. We've got this series working. Everything's going to be great. We just have to wait until 1985. Meanwhile, over at Marvel. In 1984, Kenner landed a deal to produce action figures of DC comic characters in what they were going to call their Superpowers line. Mattel had actually bid on this line of action figures, but lost. They went into a panic. They don't want Kenner to have a monopoly on superhero action figures. So they went to their second choice, Marvel. Now, even though Marvel was way outselling DC, the characters involved by the general public were seen to be much more popular or much more well-known at DC. Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman were far better known to the average person. So they went to Marvel and said, hey, we've already got the Masters of the Universe series, but we're willing to do Marvel action figures. But you got to do two things for us. One, we want a big comic book event where all the people that we've got in our action figure line can fight each other, and that'll get us interest and actually will help explain who these characters are to kids who don't know who Wolverine or whoever is. Second, and this is really important, this series needs to have two words in its title, because there's two words that our market research shows drives kids wild. Those two words are secret and wars. You knew that was coming. Okay, so Secret Wars is a go at Marvel. Jim Shooter is the head of Marvel. We all know about Jim Shooter from my earlier talk about Valiant. Now, first thing is he has to pick somebody to write this series. Now, Jim Shooter knew if he got, say, Dave Michelini to write it, that Chris Claremont would pitch a fit, because there was so much behind-the-scenes politics at the bullpen at Marvel. And he knew Claremont would throw a fit if Michelini wrote X-Men characters in the book. He could turn it over to Chris Claremont, but then he knew John Byrne would pitch a hissy, because no way was Chris Claremont touching my Fantastic Four. No, he knew that he needed to find a writer with several important qualities. Somebody that was experienced at writing large cast of characters, somebody that was up to date on the Marvel Universe, somebody that was certainly brilliant as a writer, and somebody that didn't mind being hated by all of the other writers at Marvel. Well, only one guy fit that description, and his name was Jim Shooter. So Jim Shooter has his writer for his series. He selects Mike Zeck to do the art, and they're on a go. Now, this also gave him time and chances to do some changes to the Marvel Universe that he had been wanting to do for a while. First of these changes, it was going to happen in about the middle of the series, goes back to a 1982 encounter he had with a Chicago fan by the name of Randy Schuler. Randy Schuler proposed a story to him where SpiderMan dons a high-tech, all-black costume. Jim Shooter paid this person $220 for this idea, and then put it in his pocket and forgot about it until Secret Wars comes along. What a great time. Spidey's going to get a new costume. First issue of this series premiered in January of 1984, and it was on and running. Yeah, no, this is not the first issue. I didn't have a copy. But it's off and running and is an instant sales hit. The first issue sells well over 750,000 copies, and every issue after it sells just as many. No huge drop-off like you get these days. By the time the 8th issue rolls around, it's time to premiere the black costume. But due to a scheduling snafu, the black costume actually premieres just a bit earlier in Amazing Spider-Man 252. Now, the artist of that series, Ron Frenz, had been waiting his whole life to draw Spider-Man. As he says it, since he was 8 years old. And he goes to Jim Shooter and says, "You've got to be kidding me. I have waited my entire life to draw this character, and now you're telling me he gets an all-new costume? And a costume that's just black." He was not happy. But Jim Shooter was used to that. So the series goes on, and basically everybody fights everybody. And that's just the first issue, and the third issue, and the sixth issue, and the ninth issue, and what have you. Basically, everybody fights everybody until issue 12, in which case everybody goes home. But it didn't matter. It was a sales blockbuster. It averaged 700,000 copies of each issue sold. Now, interestingly enough, the final issue of Secret Wars hit in January of 1985, the same month that the first issue of Crisis on Infinite Earths hit. Now, Crisis on Infinite Earths, just like the companies involved, could not have been more different from Marvel's Secret Wars. To begin with, they got right down to business. In the first 8 pages of the first issue, Earth 3 and its entire universe is destroyed. After that, the character of Harbinger starts assembling all the heroes of all the universes at this point owned by DC, including the Charlton characters, because Blue Beetle surprised everybody by being on the cover of the first issue. She assembles all those characters and says, "You gotta help us. If we don't defeat the Anti-Monitor, he will destroy everything." The stakes are high, and this allows DC to get right to work revamping their universe, and they're ready to do it with a pickaxe and a shovel. Now, through this time, George Perez was busy drawing every possible thing he could cram into every possible page. Just look at that spread from issue number 5. There's 180 characters in that panel. 180. Go ahead, I'll hold it here for just a moment for you to count. You done? You counted them? We're good? Okay. That was George Perez. He poured his heart and soul into this series. Now, he was also aware that there was a death list floating around at DC as this book was being put together. That death list was characters that they were willing or insistent upon not surviving the end of this series. Right at the top of that series was Supergirl. Now, Supergirl was, in 1985, a very unpopular character. Despite her connection to one of the most iconic characters in all of comics, she had become just an afterthought. DC had tried everything they could. They had given her new costumes. They had given her series restart after series restart. They'd even given her a cool 80s era headband. Nothing worked. In her most recent series, The New Adventures of Supergirl, just flopped, and it flopped hard. Well, one of the goals of this series was to simplify and streamline the mythos of a lot of their iconic characters, Superman being one of them. So she had to go. Marv Wolfman and George Perez, however, approached this not as if she was an unpopular character, but as if she was the most popular female character in the DC universe. Her death scene was a moving, poignant section. And frankly, I was there. There were so many fans who would not touch Supergirl with a 10-foot pole who read this issue and came to me teary and said, "Supergirl is my favorite comic book heroine ever." It was draining. It was wrenching. It was heartfelt and emotional. And we knew that DC was going to give us a couple of months to get our feet back under us. Unfortunately, the very next month, we get another big one. Now, Flash was on the death list that circulated at DC, but Marv Wolfman did not want to kill him. He thought there was definitely still some life left in the Flash. But at this point, the character was perceived as stodgy and old-fashioned, and frankly, his book did not sell. It had dropped 40% in sales from 1980 to 1984. DC wanted to shake things up. This was going to shake things up pretty seriously. Now, in the regular Flash series, he had been transported to the far distant future, where he was now standing trial for the murder of his wife, Iris West. They wrapped this up in this issue, number 350, which hit the stands a month before Crisis number 8. And as you see in this one, he walks off in the sunset because it turns out at the end of the series, Iris West is alive. It's a great wrap-up to the storyline. He's exonerated of all charges, and he walks off in the sunset with his wife, and as the book says, and they lived happily ever after. For a while. The death list was reportedly pretty long, and a 1986 issue of Amazing Heroes listed 40 heroes that died in the Crisis on Infinite Earths series. Now, a lot of this was B characters or alternate Earth characters that weren't as important, but it still helped him clean up continuity. Aquagirl, Huntress, the Earth 2 Robin, all characters that perished in addition to the heavyweights like Flash and Supergirl, and pretty much everybody from Earth 3. Overall, it had its problems, but it was a heartfelt, epic series, and it did exactly what they set out to do because it changed DC's image forever. So again, could not be more different from Secret Wars. But both books together, as polar opposite as they may be, together ushered in the era of the comic book event. It was no longer enough for Superman and Batman and SpiderMan to just fight villains and return things to the status quo at the end of the issue. The tagline for Crescent Infinite Earths was, the DC Universe will never be the same. And it was not hyperbole. It was not the same after Crisis on Infinite Earths. Secret Wars may not have had those kind of changes, but direct market representative Carol Kalish said in a retailer meeting, she said, let's be honest, everybody, Secret Wars was crap, but did it sell? The answer was yes, it absolutely did sell, crap or not. An interview with a Chicago Comic Club member proudly said every member of his comic club bought the entirety of Secret Wars and all its crossovers. But then he begrudgingly admitted they just didn't read it. I think this can best be summed up. New York retailer Bruce Conklin said, every time Marvel puts out a book like that, they lose the confidence of the buyer just a little bit more, no matter how much money they make on it. They're winning the battle, but they're losing the war. Now, if you want to read Secret Wars, it's out in a big, massive, honking trade paperback. Marvel's going to keep this available forever because Marvel wants your money. And if you want to watch a bunch of guys fight a bunch of other guys, sure, this is your book. It's a little bit on the every 80s side, but Crescent Infinite Earths is still a classic. Everything changes with this book. So if you're going to read one of the two, I think you could probably guess which one I'm going to recommend. Either way, there are countless other epic crossovers to read, from Civil War to Legends to whatever the latest Marvel mega crossover is. They're all out there for everybody. Will this continue in the industry? As long as you guys keep buying them. They're going to keep coming out with more Secret Wars. They're going to keep coming out with more universe-changing events. But hey, if that's what you want, they're in the business to give you exactly that. Guys, I appreciate so much you tuning in. Don't forget the 3 S's. Like, subscribe, and share. And hopefully I will see you again next time as we dive into something else about comics history or whatever you basically guys want to know. Give me a buzz. This is what I enjoy doing, and I'm doing this for you guys. So if you've got a story to tell, if you remember the 80s, if you've got a favorite crossover event that you loved or one you particularly hated, guys, we got comic sections for just that reason. I will be reading them. We'll see you there. Guys, take care of yourself. Have a great day.